It's the end of the year, and since I predominantly cover McFarlane Toys as far as Batman action figures are concerned here on the channel, I figured that it's about time that we look back at 2022 and look at the top 5 McFarlane Toys action figures that are reviewed on the channel. Couple of disclaimers, of course, as I just kind of foreshadowed or hinted at in that phrase, the figures in this ranking are going to be qualified by them being covered on the channel. So if there is a particular figure that you love, but you didn't see it get reviewed on the channel, it's not going to qualify for the top 5 ranking or even the honorable mentions at that. And then the other disclaimer that I think could be a point of contention for some folks that could actually anger others is that sadly I will have to disqualify repaints because essentially they are figures that were released in other years and they just got a little bit of a touch-up or slight modification when they got re-released in 2022. Yes, that arguably means that there will not be any of the Arkham City figures that were revamps or retouch-ups or again repaints of existing figures such as Arkham City Infected Joker or the Arkham City interpretation of Batman. As much as I genuinely do love that figure, it's just a head swap and essentially a touch-up on the bat symbol, but otherwise it's the exact same figure that I covered from 2020 for the Arkham Asylum line, so those figures will not qualify. And one last disclaimer, if you're interested in any of the action figures that show up in this top 5 ranking, there's going to be links in the description that take you on over to BigBatToyStore.com. They do help out the channel in the process if you utilize those links, but you can then add them to your collection and feed into your collecting addiction going into 2023. I appreciate you guys in advance. Being placed at number 5 is actually not going to be an action figure per se. I guess it technically counts as a vehicle, and that's going to be for the Joker Dragon from Dark Knight's Death Metal. This also happens to be one of the figures that was nominated for Toy of the Year. I can't remember what the institution was, but it was actually up for some awards. The Joker Dragon, I mean, out of all things. And frankly, I guess, added to that repertoire of acclaim and nominations and kind of garnering that attention is going to be my number 5 spot for top 5 McFarlanes of 2022 because it actually caught me by surprise by how much I love the detail and paint applications and just sheer badassery behind the ridiculousness of having Joker be turned into a dragon and being rideable by an awful lot of the 7-inch Batman figures, specifically the ones from Dark Knight's Death Metal. It complements the aesthetic of how McFarlane always loves to go for that gothic, very dark and heavy metal nature, and Joker Dragon does not disappoint and ultimately left a very unique stamp on my feelings for that figure, considering how unique and unforgettable it truly was with that design. Number 4 was actually a very late addition, but one that I was thankful enough to have been able to get reviewed right on time for this ranking, and it's also one of the biggest surprises of the year, at least personally for me. That's going to be the Mortal Kombat 11 Batman Who Laughs, and that's just it. It comes from the Mortal Kombat 11 line and not so much DC Multiverse. Granted, I know that McFarlane himself didn't design the character of Batman Who Laughs. He is actually a byproduct of Greg Capullo and other artists over at DC, but they all kind of share similar kind of aesthetics as far as how they like to interpret those characters, with a lot of like the spiky gothic nature, almost teetering on that of BDSM, but I feel like McFarlane Toys was able to capture the essence of the character and all of its very gory and bloody detail, with the blood coming out of the mouth, the teeth being etched in rather well, as well as the costume itself is done very effectively with great little nuances and details, and I was blown away by how much I love the articulation. Very fluid, very flexible, but also making it a very good figure to pose and kind of mess around with. And again, it's the surprising nature of it being a non-DC Multiverse figure and more leaning on the camp of Mortal Kombat 11, let alone being a skin, a DLC skin for Noob Saibot that just took me by surprise all the way. Okay, number 3 was a little bit on the difficult side, I will admit, because there were a handful of different figures that I was tossing and turning and whipping and swapping all over for this particular spot. The top two were kind of locked. Number 3 was kind of the one that was up in the air for the majority of the time as I contemplated this list, but ultimately I had to settle on another figure that was very well detailed, sculpted, and even articulated in some of the more surprising ways, and even at times surprised me by the lack of articulation that needed to happen so to have a much more faithful interpretation in McFarlane Toy form. and that's going to have to be for Arkham Knight Scarecrow. There's something about this figure that, despite having a slightly inaccurate color scheme that is much more favored by the gold label interpretation that's much more on the browner side because of how his aesthetic is supposed to look, there's just so much great detail put into the little things about this figure that made it in its way to one of my favorites. The more I thought about it, the more I thought to myself, this has to be given over to the Scarecrow from the Arkham Knight line because of how well they were able to etch in the mask, the little, the stitchings and everything that came really well into making sure that the amount of work that Rocksteady put into that design in-game was put almost equivalently by McFarlane Toys when they brought forward that figure, especially when it came to that leg brace. That's where the pullings of the articulation back actually helped in making the figure feel much more awesome than it actually ended up hurting, because usually I don't like it when figures hold back on the articulation. This time it actually kind of helped because in its place was that leg brace that helped the figure feel much more part of that world, because that's what happened with Scarecrow in the original game. So to me, it kind of spoke to me because of how much of a fan I am of the Arkham series, and likewise it made me a fan of this figure as well. Alright, so that brings us to the number 2 figure of McFarlane Toys that I've covered on the channel, and that is going to be for that DC Rebirth Batman, because of the way that it's ultimately one of the better looking costumes, not only in comics as from a design standpoint, but McFarlane Toys was able to reciprocate that with a really great feeling in hand figure that, albeit, goes a little exaggerated on the thighs when it comes to those massive thunder thighs that we've all kind of memed at this point from us collectors. But there is a really cool nuance to the way that he still looks badass despite having a much more lanky physique, and yet it services itself to being a figure that does well with customization, does well with posability, and an awful lot of photography, as Reddit users like to say, photography, toys. And anyways, moving on, DC Rebirth Batman is one of the most impressive Batman incarnations in McFarlane Toy form, with the posability, the batarang that's thrown in, as well as just what it lends to the variance, the variable nature of having different Batman, and this one kind of standing out a little bit more than some of the others as far as the suit, and also looking like, hey, this is a different Batman wearing a different suit as opposed to the same physique Batman over and over, only with some touch-ups here and there, some color swaps, and not reutilizing the same kind of moldings that they've used before, which kind of lends to a little bit as to why I'm going into 2023 a little nervous that the Hush body is going to be utilized over and over, because we already got 2 repaints of that bad boy coming here in early 2023, and I'm hoping that McFarlane doesn't rest too easy on those laurels. And those thunder thighs are a perfect segue into my honorable mentions before we get to the number 1 spot, because not every Batman could have made the cut regardless of when I reviewed it throughout the year, but there were definitely an awful lot of additions to the collection that left an impression on me, but they just had just that one thing here and there that kept it from being excellent. And speaking of those thighs, it's actually one of the most recent reviews that I did, Page Puncher Batman from the Shazam comic wave. That costume, that incarnation is beautiful. I love the militarized look, contrary to how I felt about it during the promo pics. But once again, those thighs come into play, and there's something about the cape that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and that's why it kind of kept it from the list. Another member of the Page Punchers wave, only this time for the Injustice 2 comic, is going to have to be Injustice 2 Batman. Is an honorable mention as well, because of the way that they were able to faithfully recreate Batman from the Injustice 2 video game. I just didn't really appreciate the stoner look they gave his face. Speaking of the way eyes are painted, the Batman from Matt Reeves' The Batman was a really good way to kind of incarnate a 7-inch or at least a 6-inch to 7-inch version of that Batman that wasn't part of like a Spin Masters or anything like that. This is probably the most faithful one that's affordable for any general consumer that likes to go to different retailers to get a worthwhile addition to their collection from the Batman movie that's not super priced at like figure arts level. Just wish that those side eyes were not present, as well as a different hand that didn't call upon buying the Bat Cycle to get that additional neutral hand on the right one instead of the karate chop thing he's got going on there. Going back to the well that always ends up giving, the Dark Knight's Death Metal line, Batrocidus and the Duke Knight Batman, I think those are really great, well sculpted figures, and the Duke Knight has some cool little attachments to the cape and the helmet that look very metal, and Batrocidus' head sculpt looks very menacing and really good in person. They just had a couple of things here and there that I just didn't feel so strongly about. The Batman Who Laughs Infected and what I like to call Zombie Batman or Blackest Night Batman definitely get some honorable mentions because of the way that they're sculpted, especially Blackest Night with the zombie look on the face that really impressed me, and Blackest Night because I actually ended up liking the articulation and the physique of that body more than I was ever expecting to. And over on the Mega Figure side, despite being a little retired from covering Mega Figures because of the way I was kind of burnt out by Bane, I still have to give some credit over to the detail and the sculpting and paint applications for Titan Joker and Killer Croc. Those two definitely get some honorable mentions that I think were definite highlights of the year that should not be skipped out on despite my reservations about Mega Figures. And if I was to go back to the Arkham City wave, despite repaints not counting towards the list, that Catwoman, that was definitely a highlight of the year. And before we throw it over to the #1 spot, let's address what could be potentially an elephant in the room that you're probably already down in the comment section saying, what about this guy? The Dark Knight Returns Batman. The Dark Knight Returns wave did come out at the very beginning of this year in January, and now it's pretty much being a bit of a peg warmer. Every time I go to Target, there's always a member of this wave found there on the pegs, just waiting to be taken. I will give some credit over to that Dark Knight Returns Batman because of how faithful it is to that Frank Miller interpretation, albeit sometimes the possibility can kind of come a little bit in the way because of how stocky and robust it truly feels. And then the other big one that I think a lot of people are looking at this list going, what the hell, is Three Jokers Batman. No doubt about it, a great Batman figure that feels very general in his design and very comic accurate, and can serve as a way to kind of fill in that void of having a very comic accurate Batman that doesn't lean in any kind of direction as far as specific iterations are concerned. But I feel like that figure gets amplified even better when customizers and people that like to build custom figures and repaints and things like that on their own is favored better by those people because they can kind of kit bash and kind of maneuver it that way. And that's, I think, where that figure works best, not under my jurisdiction, so to speak, because it's just going to be part of the collection, and it didn't have as great of an impact because I'm not that great at customizing figures. I feel like if I was, that figure would have ended up a little higher on my list, possibly breaking the top 5. But as it is, it definitely deserves an honorable mention, just didn't make the cut for me personally. And while we're speaking of the Three Jokers line, I'll also give another honorable mention to that Red Hood, only because of how much more of a faithful look of that character is done in that wave, as opposed to whatever the hell they were doing over at Gotham Knights. So without further ado, let me present to you my #1 McFarlane Toys action figure that I reviewed on the channel for 2022. And it ends up being a goddamn Superman figure if you want to get technical. Yes, it is Speeding Bullets Batman, or Superman in Batman's suit from the one-off comic book arc. There's something about the way that this costume is designed that's both simple to articulate and pose, and yet very complex as far as how cool this color scheme works. It's complex and awesome in its simplicity, if that makes any sort of sense. There's something about the way that the mask is just like overall covered, but really well sculpted, doesn't feel off in any kind of dimension, while at the same time, the flight base combined with the aerodynamicy of the figure looks really good on shelf, in poses, complementary to the Batrocidus figure, but also with other variations of the character. He looks good next to DC Rebirth Batman. He looks great with Three Jokers Batman. There's just something that just fits really well. He's like that piece of furniture, that piece of furniture or that console or that device that's in all black and it just looks good next to your entertainment system. You don't know what it is, you don't know exactly what brand it is, but for some reason it just looks well with the whole ensemble. And to me, I feel like out of all the figures, Speeding Bullets Batman was able to achieve that over the other 4 figures that managed to make the cut. And that wraps up my top 5 McFarlane Toys action figures of 2022. Again, didn't manage to review everything because these figures cost money, for God's sakes. But on top of that, also I'm running out of space and also out of time. With all that said, now I want you guys to go into the comment section and let me know your guys' top 5 McFarlane toys. They don't necessarily have to be just Batman figures. They could also be Superman, anything DC related, hell, anything Spawn related, because I know it was another big year for Spawn figures, for even some of the McFarlane Dragons figures. Anything that came from McFarlane Toys, let me know in the comment section. Maybe some of the page punchers, like the 3.5 ones or the 7-inch ones, maybe some statues, DC Direct stuff. Let me know all of that stuff down below. Of course, if you guys enjoyed the video for the top 5 McFarlane Toys ranking, hit the thumbs up. If you disagreed with some of the entries or just didn't like the video, hit the thumbs down. It's still informative to me. And of course, if you guys want to see some more stuff coming in 2023 for McFarlane Toys and Batman alike, then make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay tuned. Otherwise, guys, appreciate you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. In the meantime, though, stay humble.